When you're purchasing a home and obtaining a mortgage, you probably already know that you're going to need a down payment on that property. But what you might not have been aware of is that you need money to cover your closing costs, which are the costs you incur on top of the down payment when buying a home. Today, we're going to talk about ways to have the seller of the property cover those costs and how much of those costs they're actually able to cover for you. Now, if you want to know more about closing costs in general, make sure to subscribe and watch my video that details all of the closing costs, itemizes them out, and explains how they work and where they come from when you're buying a home. Today, we're going to specifically focus on these topics. We're going to talk about the types of loans being obtained and the seller credits for each. We're going to talk about the different property types that you might be purchasing and the types of seller credits that are allowed based on your occupancy of those properties. The type of seller credits allowed based on the down payment, since it's going to vary depending on how much money you're putting down. What the contribution type is, meaning how much they can actually give from the seller's side, and what the max seller contributions are, depending on the type of loan and the type of occupancy of the property. Now, let's talk about conventional loans first. They're the most common type of loan that we see buyers obtaining or borrowers obtaining. So a conventional mortgage on a primary residence or a second home, meaning a home that you're not going to live in year-round or a home you are going to occupy year-round, they actually allow the same amount of seller credits. So it's a little bit different when we get to investment property, which we'll discuss next. But if you're looking to buy a primary residence or a second home, the seller credits are going to vary depending on the amount of money you're putting down on the property. Now, if you're putting less than 10% down, the maximum seller credit you're allowed to receive is 3%. So as an example, if you're buying a $300,000 property, 3% of $300,000 is $9,000, which means the maximum seller credit in that example would be $9,000, which might not cover all of your closing costs, but it should cover a substantial portion of those costs. If you're putting between 10 and 25% down, you can receive up to a 6% seller credit. So let's look at the same example. $300,000 property, 6% seller credit, you're allowed $18,000 maximum on that transaction as a credit from the seller. Now, $18,000 would likely exceed your closing costs, so you might not need to go that high. However, you are allowed to receive up to that amount. If you're putting more than 25% down, you can actually receive up to a 9% seller credit, right? So same example, 9% of $300,000 would be $27,000. Now, as I said, closing costs typically aren't that much. However, we can figure out ways, or your lender can figure out ways to use a credit that large toward your costs. So maybe they can do a temporary rate buy down, which could be relatively expensive depending on the property and the loan amount. That money can go toward your temporary rate buy down as well as your closing costs. If you want to know more about what a temporary rate buy down is and how they work and how they're calculated, make sure to check out my video specifically on interest rate buy downs. However, if you're going to use a full credit of 9%, you're going to have to get something like a temporary rate buy down to eat up those funds, since none of that money from the seller can go toward your down payment. Now, if you're using a conventional mortgage to purchase an investment property, meaning a property you're planning to rent out, you're never going to occupy the property. It's not a vacation home. The maximum seller credit is going to be 2%. No matter how much money you put down. Now, the minimum down payment on an investment property is 15%, which is why I have this here for you. However, whether you put 15%, 20%, 25%, 30%, doesn't matter. The max seller credit is 2%. So back to a $300,000 property, a 2% seller credit would be $6,000 maximum on that property. Now, FHA loans. So FHA loans are the most common type of mortgage we see used by first-time buyers. They're not only for first-time home buyers, but as I said, they're most commonly used by first-time home buyers. And if you want to know more about FHA mortgages, check out my video specifically about FHA mortgages, how they work, and who qualifies for them. But on an FHA mortgage, what's nice is that they allow for as little as 3.5% down, but no matter what, whether it's 3.5% down, 4.5%, 5%, 6%, 7%, doesn't matter, you can receive up to a 6% seller credit. So let's stick with our example of $300,000. If you're borrowing or buying a home for $300,000 and you get 6% seller credit, that's $18,000, which will more than cover the closing costs on your purchase, allowing you to get into the property for just the down payment of 3.5%, which is going to be pretty nice for you as a buyer. VA loans can only be used on a primary residence. You have to be a veteran or active duty military or the spouse of a deceased veteran to qualify for a VA mortgage. However, they don't require a down payment. If you're going to get a seller credit, the maximum seller credit you can receive is 4%. Of that 4% seller credit, if you wanted to use a portion to buy down your interest rate, meaning buy a lower than market interest rate for the life of the loan, the max you can pay in discount points is 2%. So you can use 2% of that 4% toward buying a lower rate if you wanted to. The remaining 2% can go toward the closing costs. Once again, on a $300,000 property, if you get a 4% seller credit, that's $12,000 to use toward the closing costs on the property. Since VA loans do not require a down payment, right? It's not applicable on a VA mortgage, then all of the money goes towards closing costs, and $12,000 in that example could potentially cover all of the costs, allowing you to get into a home with no money out of your own pocket. Now, USDA loans are another option that allows for 100% financing, and it allows up to a 6% seller credit. Now, the caveat with a USDA mortgage is that you have to be buying a property in what qualifies as a rural area. As long as you are buying in a rural area and you qualify for a USDA mortgage, you put no money down, you can receive up to a 6% seller credit. Use the same example as before, $300,000 purchase price, 6% seller credit is $18,000, which will more than cover all of the costs you're going to incur to purchase a property using a USDA mortgage, meaning once again, just like in the VA example, you could potentially buy a home with zero money out of your pocket. Now, there's other options to get money toward your closing costs or toward your down payment. In this case, we're specifically talking about seller concessions and what's allowed, what's not allowed as far as the amounts are concerned. If you want to learn about down payment assistance or other types of programs that can give you money toward a home purchase, make sure to subscribe and you can watch videos specifically on those topics. If you have questions on this topic or any others, make sure to comment below. I do reply to 100% of the comments that are made on my page, and subscribe for more videos just like this one.